Hi, this is Dan Heisman, and we're here with another YouTube video to help you improve your chess game. One of the things I get asked is, why should I study amateur games? I want to only study master games to see what I should be playing. And the answer is, well, you want to mostly study master games, but if you never look at any amateur games, you don't see what people are doing wrong that are similar to you, and what they could have done to prevent that, and if someone who you're playing against does something wrong, what you need to do to take advantage of that. And this idea of avoiding these kind of common mistakes and recognizing them and doing something about them is mostly absent from the top level games, where the person who wins usually wins by, outplaying his opponent, getting a better position, and then putting the pressure on and breaking his opponent down. It's not usually these kind of amateur mistakes where they do something where you can quickly take advantage of it, or whether you should learn how to not do those exact same things so that you don't play that way. That's why I wrote my book, which I think is one of my very best books, called The World's Most Instructive Amateur Game Book. And when people ask me what my best books are, I always put that one on the list because I really think it's a good book for showing these things. So I had a recent game with a student that I wanted to show you, and the whole game is fairly interesting, but there's a double blunder around move 9. What's a double blunder? A double blunder is when one side makes a terrible mistake and then the other side doesn't take advantage of it. They make a big mistake by not taking advantage of it. So let's look at the game and let's look at the double blunder and we'll take some time and try to figure out from the person who made the mistake side, what was the mistake, why did they make it, what could they have done to avoid it, and from the person who could have taken advantage of that, why didn't they? Because these are the kind of things that if you think about when you're playing, you're going to get better. One of the things that was mentioned in today's game at the World Championship was that Nepo sometimes plays too quickly in critical positions. So that's a big mistake that we're going to see in possibility in this game too, where the first step is recognizing that the position could be critical, and the second step is seeing what you can do about it, which sometimes takes time. All right, so white opens up d4. Black plays an Indian type knight f6, and white says, let me play a London system, bishop f4. Black immediately strikes the dark squares with c5, a very reasonable move. White can keep it like a London with an e3 or c3, or he could play it like a Benoni with d5. White plays c3, and black goes consistently after the dark squares with queen to b6, putting pressure on this square and this square. Notice they're both dark squares. One of the squares is a square that the bishop has already abandoned, so it's kind of a consistent way to play this. All right, so white plays queen to c2. Even though queen c2 looks like a reasonable move to develop the queen and threaten e4, the problem is that later on black can put a rook on the c file and hit him, and also the knight going to c6 can go to squares that are going to attack the queen. So the consistent way to play against this would be pawn takes pawn, and now white's threatening queen takes c8, winning instantly, and black should just play knight c6, putting pressure on d4 and b2. And you even see sometimes lines like knight f3, d6, e3, bishop to f5, with the idea that if queen takes f5, then queen takes b2, and if white plays bishop d3, then bishop takes d3, queen takes d3, queen b2, and what black wins a pawn because white can play something like queen c3 to guard the rook, but he loses a pawn. So that would be the consistent way of playing it. Instead, black plays d5, which of course looks okay, but it really isn't consistent with his previous moves. White plays e3. Now black could either develop the knight, or he could develop the king bishop with either e6 or g6. He plays e6, white plays knight f3, bishop d6, neutralizing the London bishop. White plays knight e5. All right, so white's moved the knight twice. The knight's on a good square, but it's nothing to worry about. Black should just castle here and continue his development. Black plays this move, knight c6. So this is where the mistakes start to come in. When white plays knight to e5, What he's doing later is getting a discovered attack on this bishop. So the queen has to remain guarding this bishop on d6. If he doesn't, then all of a sudden, all the white knight moves become candidate moves with a discovered attack. This is how you get tactics. You get tactics when either you break down your opponent or your opponent just simply does something that's wrong. So here, knight c6 removes the guard on his bishop, which means immediately every knight move becomes a candidate. All right, so it doesn't quite work yet for white. Let's say white tries some of these moves. Well, first of all, if he plays a move like knight to g6 and just simply attacks the rook and the bishop, let's let Stockfish explain to you why that's not good. Stockfish says that in this position, you can just take the knight. If he takes here, you take back. If he takes back on d4, you have a discovered attack on the bishop, also hitting the queen. And on pawn takes, queen takes bishop, and black wins a pawn. All right, how about knight takes f7? Well, you play bishop takes f4. Now, white has two choices. Well, he really doesn't have two choices. If he takes the bishop, black will take the knight and be up a piece. So in this position, white would have no choice. He'd have to take the rook. And you might say, but white's getting a rook for a bishop. That's a really good deal. He's winning the exchange. Well, not really, because this knight is trapped. And even though it'll take a few tempos for black to win it, black will play something like bishop to h6. If white plays bishop d3, trying to take this pawn and then get the knight out, black has pawn takes, and simply bishop d7. If he tries bishop takes h7, knight takes, queen takes, and here comes that queen takes b2 again. And white doesn't have enough. He could play queen checks, king up. He could take a rook, then check, king up, knight takes check. It's always fun to have these computer attacks. If he takes the knight, in the game they suggest king d3 is mate in 3. If he plays here, check, here, checkmate.
Checkmate.
All right, no one's going to see all that, or at least not anybody probably watching the video, but it just goes to show that two things. One is unguarding this bishop leads to all kinds of tactics, and two, white can't quite do them yet, but he has to look for them. Well, that means if you're a good player and you're playing this game, when you play knight c6, you have to pretty much calculate a lot of what I just looked at to see if he can play knight f7. Well, I can almost guarantee you that players at this level, when they play knight c6, they're not calculating knight takes f7, bishop takes f4, knight takes h8, bishop h6, do I trap the knight? They're basically just kind of not paying that much attention to the fact that their bishop is hanging. And white needs to spend a lot of time looking at these lines too to see if they work. Well, it turns out they don't, but a good player would spend a lot of time here looking at seeing if they can get away with knight takes f7 or something similar. Obviously, knight takes c6 doesn't work because the queen can take back and guard the bishop. Okay, so already both sides are well, black's looking for trouble and white already has some work to do to look, but I think both sides are sort of playing relatively fast here, kind of oblivious to all the possibilities they're now creating. So white plays bishop to e2, and black should modify this problem now. He should probably maybe even play bishop takes knight. In fact, you could see Stockfish says bishop takes knight, which gives up the bishop pair, but it creates a target on e5. After pawn takes knight here, black's attacking this pawn twice, and it's only guarded once, and already white's got a problem. So bishop takes knight is a very reasonable move here. It's the best move, and it gives black some advantage. All right, let's move the engine analysis down for the moment. All right, so white plays bishop e2, and black plays castles. And again, we have to look at all these discovered attacks with the knight because the bishop's hanging. White plays h3, which kind of ignores the point completely, but he's used to the fact that in the London, he needs a place for the bishop to go. But in this particular position, knight to h5 just loses the knight to bishop takes h5. So h3 isn't really necessary like it is in a lot of London systems when you're in this particular position. All right, so white plays h3, kind of a rote move. And black, again, should try to solve his problem by either guarding the bishop or taking the knight. Instead, he plays knight to d7. All right, so knight to d7 is the biggest mistake of the game for black. Why is it a mistake? Well, you could probably figure it out pretty quickly given what I've already said, which is all the knight moves on e5 are candidate moves. Well, we looked at moves like knight f7 and knight g6, but all of a sudden, he's got another piece to take. Well, we saw that knight takes c6, taking a piece didn't work because when the queen recaptures on c6, the queen guards the bishop on d6. But now with the knight on d7, simply knight takes d7, hits the queen, and he's got to take back, and then you play bishop takes, hitting the rook and the pawn, and you're up a knight, and you're winning, you're up a bishop, and you're winning another pawn on top of it. So how could black make such a mistake? Well, I asked black after the game what he was thinking, and he was saying to himself, boy, that knight on e5 is really annoying to me. I really want to get him out of there, so I need to attack him some more. Right now, I've only got 2 pieces attacking him, and he's got 2 guarding him. And if I take him off with the knight, knight takes e5, he can take me back and fork my bishop and my knight. So maybe I should just attack him again. This is a thought process error that I call hand-waving. Hand-waving is where you're not really analyzing the sequence of moves to see if they're safe or what might happen. You're just kind of generalizing the ideas on principle and trying to do something. So what black's trying to do here is add more pressure to the e5 square. But what any good player, or even players a little bit above this level, would see is that knight d7 is not safe. And one of the first things you want to ask yourself about your candidate moves is not only what do they do, what are all the things my candidate moves do, and what does it make that makes them a candidate move? For instance, knight d7 is a candidate move because it attacks e5 a third time and it's only guarded twice, so in a sense it's a threat to win a pawn. But you also have to ask, is the move safe? Well, in order for it to be safe, all of your opponent's checks, captures, and threats must be safely met on the next move. Well, but black didn't do that. He didn't say, if I play knight d7 and white plays knight takes d7, he's hitting my queen, I have to recapture on d7 because if I move my queen, he's going to keep taking things off. But if I do recapture, he'll play bishop d6 and I just lose a piece. That's the most important thing. The most important thing here for black is not to hand wave the position, not to only look one move deep and say, gee, if I play knight d7, my knight is guarded, so I'm okay. Well, that's not enough, because if he takes it, it's a discovered attack on the d6 square. When you make a move like that, you have to be able to say to yourself, what are all his capturing sequences? What are his checks, captures, and threats? And can I see them through to the end and make sure they're safe? Well, this is not a advanced combination. After knight d7, knight takes d7 is not something out of a intermediate tactic book. This would be in a basic tactic book. For instance, if we use John Dane's chess tactics for students, it would be one of the easier problems in the book. If we go to a book like the new book by Giannotto's Everyone's First Chess Workbook, which I also think is very good for this kind of stuff, this would not be one of the harder problems in the book. I mean, Giannotto starts easier than the Bain book does, but it wouldn't be too far into the book, maybe halfway through the book, where he would get to stuff like this, which is very, very basic and straightforward. But when we have people who are decent players, and the players here are decent, but they're not, they're not strong intermediates, but they're decent, but a lot of times they think about the wrong things. You always have to think about the safety first. If the move's not safe, you can't do it, and you have to work out the safety. It doesn't take a lot of time, but on every move you need to be in the habit of figuring out, is that move safe? Okay, so we see why black played knight to d7, even though it's just a terrible, terrible move. All right, so what should white be thinking now? White should be thinking, all right, he's moved knight to d7. The 2 questions you want to ask yourself when your opponent makes a move are, what are all the things that move does? Not just why did he make that move, but what are all the things that move does, and is that move safe? All right, well, the more important of the 2 is actually, is it safe? Because if it's not safe, the other things it does may not be as important. For instance, if you could just checkmate someone, it doesn't really matter what they're threatening. So here, white should say to himself, all right, knight to d7, that attacks my knight on e5 3 times. It's only guarded twice. Let me start looking at all my sequences where I can save the knight. Well, he could just move the knight to a safe square, but it's always more forcing to look at the captures first, because maybe one of them does something. So The first moves you want to look at in a position like this are knight d7 and knight c6. Those are the moves. And the fact that you're getting a discovered attack on the bishop on d6 is a super added bonus. So you have to say to yourself, if I play knight takes d7 and I'm hitting his queen, how does he save the queen? All right, well, he saves the queen by taking my knight. Now, if you stop there and you say, well, that's just a trade, then that would be what we call a quiescence error. It's a quiescence error because even though the knight on d7 is guarded once and it's attacked once, that doesn't mean the move was safe, because we could look a little bit further, and when I say a little bit, we mean as little as possible, a half a move further, and we see there's a hanging bishop. But we knew this all along because for the last few moves, every move of this knight would be an attack on a bishop that's not guarded. That's what I call the seeds of tactical destruction. A seed of tactical destruction is something wrong with your position that tells your opponent that they might have a tactic. Well, here, every knight move is a discovery against an unguarded piece. So every knight move becomes a candidate move for a possible tactic. After knight d7, this tactic comes to full fruition, and in a very easy way, knight takes d7 wins the piece, as we just saw. Now, how would white miss this? Well, white would miss this if he makes the assumption, for instance, that he's playing a very strong computer that would never, ever, ever make a silly tactical mistake, and therefore you just assume that your opponent's move is safe. If you assume your opponent's move is safe, then you're not going to look for a tactic. But of course, even grandmasters make big mistakes. If we saw today's ninth game of the World Championship match between Carlsen and Nepo, Nepo played the move c5, which was a giant mistake. Carlsen kind of made a strangly face and looked at the board and said, gee, what if I trap that bishop with c6? How does he save it if I start attacking it? And he calculated for a few minutes. It's a critical position. He can't just play it right away. And he figured out all the lines, and he said, yep, I'm going to win that bishop. And after a few minutes, he played c6, and then Nepo probably saw it on the monitor. But Nepo didn't even show up in the room for several minutes after he had made that mistake, and he got his own piece trapped. So even if you're playing one of the world's top grandmasters, they're not Stockfish 14. They're not going to be safe for the next 7 moves no matter what happens. They can make mistakes. They're only human. They get tired. They play too fast. They have psychological problems. So no matter who you're playing, you have to assume the move might not be safe. Well, here, knight to d7 isn't safe. But if white assumes it's safe, he's not going to look for his checks, captures, and threats to see if he can do it. He'll just say, oh my goodness, he's attacking my knight 3 times on e5, and I'm only guarding it twice, so I need to move my knight somewhere safe. Okay, well, part of that is true, but the full psychological impact is that capturing things first is a much more likely sequence to win you something than not. So when I say likely than not, meaning if you don't capture something, if you make your first move of knight f3 or knight d3, the chances that will win something are much, much, much less than the chances if you play knight takes d7. Meaning checks, captures, and threats are a lot more likely to win material than something where you're not doing that, where you're just retreating the knight and just saving it. All right, so that's kind of the anatomy of this double blunder, because what does white play here? He plays knight d3, hitting the pawn twice, hitting this bishop, and guarding his bishop, but now it's black's move and white hasn't captured anything, so black can simply solve his problem of his hanging bishop by taking on f4. All right, so we've talked a lot about the double blunder, but the rest of the game is a little interesting, so let's go through it relatively quickly to finish the video. Black does trade off, plays knight f6, white plays knight d2, rook e8, getting ready to play his break move e5, knight f3, trying to stop it. Black says, I have enough on it. White trades. White tries to put some pressure on this d-pawn, which is a little bit vulnerable because there's no e-pawn to guard it. Black plays a nice sequence here. He plays knight takes, bishop takes, and plays d4. Normally you can't do stuff like this, but if you have a rook on the same line with his king, then you can take advantage of the pin, and white can't take the pawn. Pawn takes, rook takes because of the sneaky pin. Queen takes, d4, and black just wins a rook. So in the game, after d4, white took once, but then he played e4, and now black puts pressure on the pinned e-pawn by playing bishop f5, And of course the pawn is pinned and can't take the bishop. See, it's interesting that black would play a nice move like this, which, you know, is not a beginner move, because a beginner would look at this and say, oh, I can't go there, he'll take me, without seeing the pin. And yet black earlier made, you know, a really, really bad, much more basic move. So it's kind of interesting that when you get players at this level, they can sometimes see tactical ideas that are a little more advanced, and then they'll miss something that's even easier. But you want to be consistent and try to get all the easy stuff right. It's the intermediate and harder stuff that really becomes more challenging. The easy stuff you don't want to make the mistakes on. That'll keep your rating low all the time. That's why basic tactics is what you want to study, and you want to study it over and over again, not so you can solve basic tactics. Everybody can solve basic tactics. You want to study them over and over again so you can recognize them quickly and accurately. All right, so white says, you got the pawn, I can't guard it anymore. Black takes with the bishop. White blocks with the knight. Black plays there. It's probably a little better to overprotect the pawn here for when this rook has to move. White plays rook there. Black says, well, I'm ahead, I'll just trade everything off. And he takes, but now white could take with the knight and then start attacking this pawn very quickly. And notice the white knight can attack the pawn, but the black knight can't guard it. And white already has Luft on the back rank and black doesn't. So if white plays knight to e1 and then maybe gets out a quick knight f3, he can get some pressure. Instead, he trades the rooks. And now again, knight f3 and queen d3 will try to win that pawn, or maybe queen d2 so that queen takes b2 is not possible. So black says, let's trade queens. Well, when you're losing, you don't want to trade, and the easiest endgame to win up a pawn is a king and pawn endgame, and the second easiest one to win up a pawn is knight and pawn endgame, so white doesn't want to trade here. White plays queen d2, doesn't trade. Black centralizes the queen and hits the a pawn. White says, let me save the a pawn and concentrate on this pawn. Now white's getting ready to play like knight f3, and if the pawn moves, he could move the knight back to e1 and he wins the pawn. So black has to get ready to play against that. Black has to play a move here like knight to e4, and then if knight f3, oh sorry, first he has to save the queen, yes, of course. Then if queen to d3, that gives him time to play moves like knight to g5, and now if knight to c2 hitting the pawn, he can play knight e6 guarding it, and he's still up a clear pawn with a winning position here. All right, so that's what black should do. Instead, he plays h6. But now it's pretty clear knight f3 is going to win the pawn, because after knight e4, just queen takes d4. And if knight f3, d3, white has knight to e1 again. And it's bye-bye pawn. Again, knight e4, queen takes d3. So here, white can just win the pawn because black really wasn't... He did a good thing by stopping the back rank mate, but he needed to wait a move to do that, to get his knight into position to guard the pawn. Knight e4, knight g5, knight e6. The knight e4 wins a tempo by hitting the queen. So white plays queen d3, but that, again, is the wrong tempo. He needs to play knight f3 first. So all these little tactics here. Queen d3 is a blockading move, but what he wants here is not a blockading move, but simply an attacking move to win the pawn. He plays queen d3 first. Black plays queen e4. Now, of course, the knight can't move. White still doesn't want to trade here. He could play queen to d2. He plays king f1, but now black can trade and bring his king up. Queen takes, knight takes. The king would love to be on d3 here, but the knight's in the way. King f8, king e2, king d6. Now if the knight moves, black will have just enough time to get the king up. He plays f3 to keep the knight out. Probably not his best move. King d6. Black's doing a very, very good job of, as soon as his king is safe, getting his king right to the middle here. Knight d5. Well, we just said that the easiest endgame to win up a pawn is king and pawn endgames. So you want to avoid them like the plague. Right now, black has a very healthy extra pass pawn in the middle. He's offering to trade knights. He's also threatening to fork the king and the pawn, but the king can always come back and guard this pawn. He's threatening to fork the king and the pawn over here. So maybe the king should move so there's no forks. The knight is guarding that pawn for the moment. He could play something like, well, let's see here. If the knight moves, Yeah, he is between a rock and a hard place here. If he trades knights, it's a trivial win for... You don't want to trade knights in this kind of position, but it looks like if he doesn't trade knights, he's losing another pawn. So we can't really blame him as much as we can. Some amateurs who in this kind of position trade, they go, I'm losing, I'll just trade. Well, no, they make it so much easier when you trade. One of the most important principles you want to learn and follow is when you're behind in material, especially if you don't want to make fair trades of pieces unless you're almost absolutely sure that what you're doing is going to get what you want. So here, you would never trade knights unless you're sure you can at least draw this king and pawn endgame. But unfortunately, keeping the knights on the board is bad too. All right, so white trades, which is not something I would want to do, but I can understand, at least in this situation, why he does it. Now all black needs to do is run the white pawns out of moves, and white king will have to go back. Now notice right now the two white pawns are holding the squares next to the king. So white, if he's going to leave the pawns like this, wants to leave the pawn on f3 and the pawn on b3. He could even just move the king back and forth here. He could go, after black makes his move like f5, he could just keep going king d2, king d3, and just try not to let the king get into these squares. Is that going to save the game? No, but anything else makes it really easy. So let's see what happens in the game when white ends up moving those pawns. So white plays there, black plays there, white plays there. See, but now, when white gets into Zugzwang, black's going to be able to bring his king up to e4. All right, so after f4, what white is threatening now is f takes g5, h takes g5, h4 getting an outside passed pawn. That's something I see big amateur players allowing all the time. So let's show you. If black makes a bad move like b6, pawn takes, pawn here, pawn takes, and all of a sudden white has some play, because even though black has two pawns, the king is next near both of them, and the black king is going to have to go all the way over here. Is that going to be enough to save the game for white? No, but if the material was even, that would be enough to win the game for white. So you always have to watch out for that kind of stuff. All right, so back to the game. In the game, black just says, all right, I have my square now, let's just run white out of moves. He plays there. White tries to save his moves. Black plays there. White plays. Now black has to figure out, do I get the tempo by pushing the pawn, or do I get the tempo by taking the pawn? Usually it's different. So here he could calculate pawn takes, pawn takes. If he plays here, white plays here, and now it's black's move, and black has to go back, and it's a draw. So that would be a terrible mistake. So really what black wants to do here, if he takes this pawn and white takes here, is push this pawn first to take away the flexibility. And now if white pushes here, black will push here. And now black wins. If black pushes the pawn up here, then we have to count the tempos again. If white pushes 1, then black will push 2 and put black in Zugzwang. But if white pushes 1, and black plays like h4 and white plays b6, now black will win not because white's in Zugzwang, but because black can play king c5 and take off the pawn. All right, so let's go back to the game. In the game, white played b4, black took, white took, and now again, black has to be careful. b5, h4, draw, because it's black's turn. So black has to play something other than that, and he does. He plays h4, a much better move, because now if white uses that tempo to come up and black comes here, it'll be white's move, and also this pawn will be vulnerable. So one way or another, after this nice move h4, black is winning. b5, b6, white goes back. Now my way of playing this usually is, I like to go up on the same side the king is so I avoid races. I don't like to go up this way and have him come up this way. But here it doesn't really matter. You just have to calculate this kind of stuff carefully, because this is what we're saying earlier in the video about critical moves. When you get these critical moves, make sure to calculate them correctly. Here it doesn't matter, but they could. He plays that way. White goes there. Black says, I'm just going to run in and get a queen. White says, I'll try to stop you. Black says, I'll just escort the pawn in. And white sees it's hopeless and gives up. All right, so today's video was the anatomy of the double blunder, but the rest of the game was interesting too. You could see the players from the rest of the game weren't that bad. You know, if we asked what's the player's playing strength for the game, if we take out that double blunder, it looks like the two players playing are like 15, 1600. But when you throw in those giant blunders like that, that double blunder, it lowers them several hundred rating points. And now they look more like, 12, 1300s instead. So it only takes that one bad move. You want to be consistent throughout the whole game and make sure that all your moves are safe. This is a really important thing that I try to teach all my students. It only takes one bad move to lose the game. You can't do the work on 92% of the moves or 93% of the moves or even 98% of the moves and be okay. For instance, if there's 40 moves in the game and you do the work on 95% of the moves, 95% of 40 is 38. That means there's 2 moves of the game where you're not doing the work. It only takes 1 to lose the game. That's not good. 95% is not good. You got to do it on every move. Is my move safe? What are all the things that move does? You got to do that work. All right, this was a very instructive video. Hopefully you learned something from it. And if you enjoyed it, please put the like or subscribe. But the best thing you can do is tell your chess friends about my chess channel, Dan Heisman Chess, and have them take a look. Thanks. See you next time. Bye.